The MCU on Disney Plus has been pretty much a mixed bag. There's some good stuff there. There's some not so good stuff there. They're definitely trying to introduce a whole new generation of heroes to the Marvel Comics universe. Now that, the Avengers are kind of disbanded, we lost a lot of our top flight A-level heroes that have been in the MCU for a while. And one of those characters is Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel. She's going to be in the upcoming movie, The Marvels, which is kind of a team up with, obviously, Captain Marvel and a couple other characters. I imagine they expected better results than they got, at least as far as viewership over the first 5 days. It is struggling. In fact, it's performing half as well as the worst performing MCU property on Disney Plus so far. That is not very good. Just being smoked by orders of magnitude by the best performing MCU properties on Disney Plus. There's a lot of reasons for that. Of course, the Shill media will not acknowledge any of that. They got to make a lot of excuses for this. So I'm going to give you the actual numbers, what's going on with Ms. Marvel on Disney Plus, talk about some of the excuses that are being made, give you a little bit of truth, and then I'm going to give you the 3 reasons I'm pretty certain that it didn't work to begin with. And I think a lot of you will agree with me, and it's pretty much common sense. So let's get into the details about how Ms. Marvel is performing on Disney Plus. Ms. Marvel is reportedly the least watched MCU series on Disney Plus. According to Samba TV, approximately 775,000 U.S. households watched the premiere of Ms. Marvel within its first 5 days on Disney Plus. This is notably down from the previous MCU series, with Loki being the highest, generating 2.5 million views, WandaVision with 1.6 million, and both The Falcon and the Winter Soldier and Moon Knight were watched by 1.8 million viewers in the first 5 days. I think one of the big issues that a lot of people had was, I don't think the trailers were very good. I don't think the promotion was very good. It doesn't look like it's a high budget project, which a lot of the MCU shows on Disney Plus have had some production value to them, but the media will not accept that. I'm going to talk about the stuff that makes the most sense, and then we're going to get to the most ridiculous stuff, which is actually from Forbes. But I'll discuss what Screen Rant had to say first, and one of the really false assumptions that they've come away with, and this is what Screen Rant had to say about the viewers that they did have. It is worth noting that while it is the lowest debut for an MCU series, Ms. Marvel was a big hit with Gen Z viewers, as audience members 20 to 24 watched it at a higher rate than other MCU series. The show also drew a more diverse audience than previous series, with an increase in Black, Hispanic, and Asian viewers. While Ms. Marvel's numbers do appear low, the fact that it is being watched by more younger viewers may suggest that older audience members are either waiting to watch or just aren't interested. So while Marvel may have lost some viewers, they have gained some new ones to make up for it. Did some new fans get introduced to the MCU for the first time through Ms. Marvel? I imagine there's a very small number that were. But when you think about the MCU itself, the success of the movies and whatnot, and the fact that the shows before this had very healthy viewing numbers in comparison to Ms. Marvel, it's probably quite minuscule. There's a very good chance that all these Gen Z viewers had actually seen the MCU at one point, likely had watched an MCU show. So that was some glass half full stuff, and I don't mind being optimistic and trying to look at the bright side, but they are definitely leaping to a conclusion there. Now let's get into some of the more excuse making from Forbes.com, specifically from senior contributor Paul Tassi. He had some interesting things to say. I'll start with the one that makes the most sense, and we'll get to the most ludicrous. Paul Tassi says, it's very clearly aimed at a younger crowd. It's the first PG-rated Marvel series and definitely draws a lot of parallels with young adult series. You may get some measure of existing Marvel fans believing this one isn't for them, which is unfortunate given that it's enjoyable regardless of what generation you're from. In some cases, a PG rating might make it seem like the show itself is more accessible to a wider audience. Maybe you can watch with the family and stuff like that. But I do think people have a general idea or feeling of what they want from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, even if it's on Disney Plus. I don't know that rated PG shows are really enticing really to the MCU audience at large. I think if you're going to make stuff really deliberately aimed at kids, it should probably be just cartoons, or if it's going to be live action, maybe they should have a kids live action alternative to the MCU with more lightheartedness, more teen angst type of stuff to really feed into that younger audience. They're obviously moving towards that, going towards this kind of young Avengers story. Obviously, they got Kate Bishop and some other heroes lined up, Kamala Khan being another one, to kind of aim at that audience and kind of maybe flesh it out. But maybe they should just be separate. You know, I don't think everything has to be completely connected, especially something that's PG. It doesn't really fit into the vibe that the MCU has been up to this point. Not that it's overly, violent or gory or anything. We haven't had any real rated R stuff, but normally the MCU hasn't really been something that you would want to watch with your 3-year-old. And I think maybe this really isn't the right direction to go with the MCU. So I don't think that one's completely crazy. Here's another one that I do think is a little bit off. Disney is pairing it with ObiWan. None of the other MCU series were layered directly on top of a high-profile Star Wars show like this. And for whatever reason, Disney insists on putting both of them out the same day, which could be hurting its viewership. I seriously doubt that. These shows are only like 40 to 50 minutes in length. Everybody's got time for 40 or 50 minutes of entertainment if they wanted to see Obi-Wan and they wanted to watch Ms. Marvel, regardless if it came out in the same day. These numbers are based on 5 days of viewership for the material. So people had plenty of time if they didn't have time the debut day and they wanted to see Obi-Wan more, to go over and catch Ms. Marvel. I don't think the Obi-Wan Kenobi show really has anything to do with the poor performance of Ms. Marvel. The reason Ms. Marvel is performing poor is it had low production values. The suit itself looked stupid, and they changed a lot about Ms. Marvel herself. So even if you were a fan of Ms. Marvel from the comic books, that's not the Ms. Marvel you're getting here now. And if you look at the performance of the other MCU shows, they've been very competitive with Obi-Wan, and one of them even eclipsed it. So I don't think Obi-Wan particularly has anything to do with this. And if you look at the box office results, I mean, Endgame obliterated the best performing sequel series movie, and even Rogue One, the Star Wars movie that people generally speaking like, it didn't perform up to like the levels of Captain Marvel or Black Panther, which weren't established heroes within the MCU. The MCU was a really hot property, probably has a wider fan base than Star Wars right now, certainly that's actively engaged in going to the movies right now, and that aren't disgruntled, because that's certainly a big part of Star Wars. So if they put out a Tony Stark Iron Man prequel show starring Robert Downey Jr. the same day that they put out Obi-Wan starring Ewan McGregor, Obi-Wan would have done the same numbers, and the Iron Man show would have done 3.5 or 4 million. You know what I mean? A lot of it has to do with the awareness of the character. The idea that fans don't have an hour and a half in their week to watch both an MCU and a Star Wars show at the same week, kind of ridiculous. Now, this final one is the most ludicrous one. It's something that you knew was going to come out, but it has to be racism, right? She's a Pakistani American Muslim. While I brought up the racism behind the review bombing of Ms. Marvel on various sites before, I realized I should also cite it here as well. Fundamentally, this is a show about a teenage Pakistani American Muslim girl where comic fan bases have had decades of white guys as heroes. That's slowly starting to change, but minority heroes as leads are still rare and unfortunately can be rejected for that reason alone among a certain subset of viewers. I personally do not believe that racism has anything to do with the low viewership of Ms. Marvel. Are there some racists out there that didn't watch the show because the character was Pakistani Muslim American? Perhaps, but I don't think it was enough to drop 1 million views off in the first 5 days. Is that the subset you're talking about? Are you trying to insinuate that there's 1 million MCU fans that are willing to watch Kate Bishop become the new Hawkeye, but aren't willing to give Ms. Marvel a chance? Absolutely ridiculous. And then when you look at superheroes, yes, a lot of the traditionally popular superheroes at DC and Marvel, which were created in like the 1940s and 1960s, are white males, but there are plenty of superheroes that have been brought to the big screen and did perfectly fine, whether they were male, female, or any other race. Black Panther, over $1 billion. Aquaman is traditionally a blonde white character played by a Pacific Islander, over $1 billion. Wonder Woman, over $1 billion. I believe Captain Marvel almost made $1 billion. There's plenty of examples right now within the viewership of Marvel and DC and comic book superhero fandom for the movies themselves, where the characters don't have to be white. This is just excuse making, and also saying there's review bombing going on out there. If you look at the Rotten Tomato numbers, the fan score is over 80%. That is very good. If they tried to review bomb it, it didn't work. You know what I'm saying? This was a show that just wasn't made for the wider viewing MCU audience. There was no established MCU hero in this show. That's the first reason that this really failed. The reason Kate Bishop Hawkeye worked is because you had Clint Barton Hawkeye in there with her. You had no other established MCU hero in this series, and that was a big drawback. The actress herself, Iman Vellani, nobody knows who that is, so there's no star power associated from the MCU with the show or from the actress's perspective either. So you have a virtual unknown character and actress going in there, and people just weren't interested. The number two reason this really didn't work is there's no real incentive to watch the entire MCU anymore. The reason that you bought in and you watched every MCU movie was because there was an Avengers movie coming out. I remember not liking the very first Iron Man movie all that much, and I stand by that. I did enjoy Thor a lot more. I enjoyed Captain America quite a bit, but I was not a customer for Iron Man #2 until I found out the Avengers were coming and there was going to be an enormous team up. And I said, now it sounds important, and now I'm incentivized to go watch something normally I would have skipped. And then after that, you had Avengers Age of Ultron, not a great movie, but a good reason to watch all the stuff prior to that. And then obviously you had the two films, Infinity War and Endgame, to kind of finish it off, and you couldn't miss anything at that point. You'd invested too much time and money into what this Avengers big payoff was going to be. There's no payoff anymore. And if there is, they haven't told us about it. I believe Kevin Feige said there's no more Avengers movie, or at least they don't have them planned. I think that's a big mistake because now people aren't incentivized to go watch it. If you produced Captain Marvel right now and didn't tell everybody that this was going to be important to watch Endgame, it would do like $500 or $600 billion rather than $1 billion. By not having a clear established plan and getting rid of the Avengers moving forward, Kevin Feige has disincentivized people to watch stuff they normally would have skipped out on. And I think that was a big mistake. And finally, the third real big reason is the MCU on Disney Plus, for the most part, has been disappointing. Like I said, there's some real high moments. That first episode of Captain America Winter Soldier is really good. Like, that thing felt like I was in a movie. The rest of the show, not so much. I really enjoyed the Hawkeye series, but it did kind of end on a dud. And the other shows people have had a lot of issues with, specifically Loki, which was the highest viewed one because it had the biggest star coming from the movie, Tom Hiddleston as Loki, and it was disappointing. I reviewed every episode of it here on the channel, and it got more and more disappointing, specifically as the show went along. So while the MCU on Disney Plus is a good idea, and if they executed it well, I think people would still be in for it, I think they're going to be more selective because for the most part, it's been hit or miss. There isn't a guaranteed level of quality that's really worth your time anymore associated with the MCU. And I think you're going to see a lot more people skipping things that they don't think are important, kind of like Shang-Chi, kind of like the Eternals. And then you'll see them turn out for Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. And that's just kind of the way the MCU is now until Kevin Feige can get an idea together and say there's going to be this big culmination and all the time and effort that you're putting into watching all this stuff is going to pay off because it's just not really there right now. Now, this isn't the first time that Miss Marvel really hasn't fared all that well. Now, the character did start out pretty good in comic books as far as sales, but it tailed off very rapidly for many reasons. I sat down with Larry Bernard a couple of years ago. We talked about why Kamala Khan failed in comic books. This was a very interesting conversation. Definitely check this out, and you can see why the characters had some problems over the years.